So he says, if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen. Why did they fall? From unbelief. Right? That's what caused, they rejected. Now we know, because we're keeping the book in context, if we were to turn back here to Romans chapter 1, chapter 2, when we first started, what was unbelief? Willful ignorance. Having known God, they did not glorify him as God. Every person who's broken off, nobody's broken off over ignorance. It's important to know that. No one's broken off because they were predestined to be broken off. They chose it. They chose willful ignorance. We choose it. But specifically, those who reject Jesus choose it as a life choice. And he says, behold the severity. This is not all of a sudden an assault on believers. Do you understand? It's really important. You don't go from Romans chapter 8:1, there's no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, to Romans chapter 11, fear lest you be broke off. And that doesn't make sense. He's speaking in general terms of Gentiles or Jews, right? Because chapter 10, verse 12 tells us, as far as salvation is concerned, there is now no difference between Jews and Gentiles. So he's saying, be careful, don't be proud, understand the fact that God was willing to set aside the Jews. He was willing to allow their hearts to be hardened, and he'll do that to you, Gentiles. If, as we became, as a group, if we become Gentiles, if we become proud against, if we begin to look for our righteousness in our own merit, right? Because the way we get proud against the Jews is to say, I deserve something. I am something. That's what pride is. Pride is to esteem yourself better or bigger or more important than something, right? That's what it is. It's to look at someone else or something else and to say, you're beneath me and I'm better than you. And that's what gives me the right to treat you poorly. It's what gives me the right to assault you. No, I'm not saying like, you say, I'm proud of my kids. Like, I get that. Like, you're proud of them in the sense that I'm happy with what they've accomplished. That's great. But he's not talking about that. He's talking about personal pride. And he's saying, just as God was willing to set aside the Jews for a time, which he sovereignly used for good, he will also and can also do that for you. And he says, verse 23, and even they, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in. Again, the same answer. Did they fall that they might fall permanently? No. Any Jew, who's the they? Any Jew, even though, what have we been reading? They're set aside. There's a spirit of stupor. God has closed we're reading. Yet, in the midst of that, personal responsibility. Anyone who decides to believe, it's grafted back in. It's not exclusive, and it's not some sort of weird deal where God prevents people from trusting him. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you are cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted in, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? This is all the answer to the same question and the same context. He says, look, if you were grafted in contrary to nature, what's normally not done, if God grafted you in when you were not part of his original Israeli people, not saying the Gentiles weren't to be saved, but didn't have the advantage of being a Jew, and God still grafted you in, how much more is he able to graft in a Jew? Someone who was born and raised and had all the ideas about who God is and the law and all these things, and has the promises, right? A seminal Jew, meaning someone who is physically descendant from Abraham, has the promises. And so he's saying, look, if it can happen to you, how much more can it happen with the Jew? Not that they get more saved or something like that, but what a reunion it will be for them. He says, lest you be wise in your own, verse 25, lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Now, we already know, how did the partial hardening happen? Well, we already have those quotes, right? That he closed the eyes of their prophets. that they, in their unbelief, rebelled. It's also noteworthy because we might be tempted to go back to chapter 9 and go, aha, he hardened Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now he's hardened the Jews. It's a partial hardening. He hardened the Jews. There's a big difference. The word in chapter 9, when it says that he hardened Pharaoh, is where we get our word sclerosis. You know, arterial sclerosis or sclerosis of the liver. And it literally means a hardening or a stiffening. A stubbornness is the implication in the Greek. That there was a stubbornness in Pharaoh, and he made his heart stubborn, and then God confirmed that stubbornness in him and used him for his glory. This word isn't stubbornness. This is a different word. It actually means to be dull. So when it says here that there's a partial hardening, it's not the same thing that happened to Pharaoh. The idea here is that there's a dullness in them. They're not paying attention. They've left. They've neglected. That's the idea here. Not that there's been like this, I will never come back to God again or something like that. Because you see that in Israel today, right? I mean, there's a lot of Israelis that are actually very much about Jehovah. But they're in a stupor, and they reject Jesus. And there will be severity for that. He's going to go on and talk about that even more. And he says, verse 26, and in this way, let me finish that verse. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, and he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Okay. So again, we have to ask ourselves, is he speaking literally, or is he speaking in generalities? When he says, and in this way, meaning the fullness of the Gentile ends. And some people look at that as when the last Gentile gets saved, or the last that God is working among the Gentiles. You can be you can decide what that means for yourself, because it's a little bit disputed. So let me know what you come up with. But they essentially, once he's done with the Gentiles, then he'll begin to work with Israel again. And it says, and all Israel shall be saved. So we have to ask ourselves, is he literally saying right now, because he quotes, right? The deliverer will come from Zion. So he makes a quote out of the Old Covenant. Is he literally saying that at that point, every single Israeli will come to Christ and get saved? Is that what he's saying? No, it's not what he's saying. We know that because the quote that he uses here, the deliverer will come from Zion and banish ungodliness from Jacob, is speaking of when Jesus returns and he saves the Israelites from the Antichrist and from earthly persecution, and he leaves them in victory. Now, we also know from Jeremiah 31 and out of Ezekiel, and I have those written down. I knew I would remember them. Yeah. Ezekiel 20 and Jeremiah 31. It tells us very clearly that when Christ returns, he will actually purge rebellious Jews that have rejected him. That there will be judgment to them. He'll judge them, is what it says. So he's not saying here that when God's done with the Gentiles, all of a sudden every single Jew just gets saved. Why? Because everybody gets to choose, right? Everybody gets to decide. But he himself will show up. That would be pretty motivating, I think. He himself, it didn't work the first time though, but he himself will show up, and whoever clings to him, acknowledges him, will be saved. Now, we don't really have a big problem with this, I don't think, because we're already told way back in Romans chapter 9 that not all Jews are a true Jew in the spiritual sense, right? That only those who are of faith, the faith of Abraham, are the true Israeli. Just like we would say of Christian, not everyone who wears the label Christian is a Christian. Not that it's for us to decide. I'm not promoting that at all. But there are a lot of people, oh man, it's been a long time since I looked, but I want to say back in like 2010, like 70% of America called themselves Christians. It seems unlikely. I can't say. I'm not God. But it feels unlikely. And so, the proclamation, though, is that God is working all things together for good for those that love him and are called according to his purpose. He's working it for the Gentiles. He's working it for the Jews. He's working for those whom he called. Who did he call? Those whom he foreknew, prognosko, the people that he knew would choose him and follow him. They would choose him. He says, those are the people that I am working every single thing the Jews rejecting, the Jews accepting, individuals, wars, all these things. He says, I'm working all of those things together for the good of what? His purpose, his people that he's gathering together to be with him forever, which could be anyone. It's not a limited thing. It's not just the elect. The elect are people that he foreknew that would choose him. Those are who the elect are. It's not just a select amount of people. It's anyone, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved.